Have you ever been part of a group, a family, circle of friends, people you work with, and you knew that someone in that group was doing something wrong and you wanted to speak up about it, you wanted to do something to stop it, but you also knew that if you did, you would be the one that the rest of the group would look down on, not the person doing the wrong thing? If you've ever been in that situation, then you have some idea what it can feel like to be a person who makes an effort to be socially conscious in the atheist movement. The last few years, there has been no shortage of videos, podcasts, tweet storms, blog articles claiming to point out what's wrong with the atheist movement. I've done a few of those myself, and I'm doing another one right now. Most recently, two such pieces have set me thinking about this. The first is a talk given at the recent Gateway to Reason conference by David Smalley, the host of the Dogma Debate podcast. The other is an article written in response to Smalley's talk by Stephanie Zvon. I have links to both of those in the description of this video, so please feel free to view them both and come to your own conclusions. As is probably no surprise to many of you, I disagree with Smalley on this. I am 100% on Zvon's side, but this video is not going to be a response specifically to Smalley's talk. Zvon's article already provides such a response, and a much better one than I ever could give, so I'm going to leave that to her. In this video, instead, I would like to talk about the wider problem exemplified by Smalley. People who share his view always seem to be sadly shaking their heads in disapproval at how divided the atheist community has become. We atheists are far too quick to eat our own, they say. We're no better than a church if we call for people to be excommunicated from our ranks simply because they're less than perfect. Why can't we just talk to each other and seek understanding and unity? When people make such statements, it sounds like they're saying we shouldn't be divided over trivial issues. And that would be a very sensible thing to say. Of course we shouldn't divide ourselves over trivial issues. So who are these divisive figures? Over what trivia are they seeking to fracture the atheist movement? Let's start with sexual harassment. As Stephanie Zvon points out in her article, the atheist movement's record of dealing with sexual harassment at conferences is spotty at best. People, mostly women, who have advocated for the implementation and enforcement of anti-harassment policies at conferences, or who have raised concerns about certain people, mostly men, being invited to appear at such conferences, have often been condescendingly placated, while their concerns have been minimized or ignored. And in some of the most well-known instances, the people who suffered the most severe consequences from sexual harassment being reported were not the men who were identified as probable harassers, or worse, but the women who raised the alarm. Remember Elevator Gate? That's where a lot of this stop dividing the movement talk began. In 2011, Rebecca Watson made a video where she talked about a conference where she appeared on a panel, and then after the panel, she wound up staying up until the wee hours of the morning, hanging out with some people, having a few drinks. She finally retired for the evening and was going back up to her room when a man approached her and got into the elevator with her and asked if she wanted to go back to his room for coffee. Rebecca Watson said no, and that was the end of that. Although when telling the story on her video, she did add, guys, don't do that. A single woman alone at a conference saying she was uncomfortable with being approached at 4 a.m. by a strange man who asks her to go back to his room, and adding a completely understandable, reasonable bit of advice, a word to the wise, as Watson herself described it. Don't do that. Not, this guy is a rapist, watch out for him. Not, all men are rapists. Just don't do that. In response to the relatively mild plea for a bit of self-awareness contained in those 4 words, Watson was subjected to a level of hate and abuse that has become sadly familiar to many people, particularly women on the internet. She was insulted. She was called misogynistic slurs. She was accused of being a man-hater. She was threatened with rape. And when she spoke out about the level of abuse she was receiving, she was publicly ridiculed by the most famous atheist in the world. A blog article by P.Z. Myers in defense of Rebecca Watson received a comment by none other than Richard Dawkins, who mocked Watson in what has since become known as the Dear Muslima comment for sharing her discomfort during the elevator incident, contrasting her experience there with the experience of Muslim women who are brutalized by their husbands under fundamentalist Islamist regimes. Who was seen as the divisive figure here? Was it Rebecca Watson, who became the target of hordes of vicious abuse for suggesting that maybe men should be a little more mindful about how they approach women? Or was it Richard Dawkins, arguably the most influential single figure in the atheist movement, who chose to mock her, who chose to attempt to shame her, and by implication everyone else who has had an experience similar to hers, into silence? You remember, in A Sign of Things to Come, it was Rebecca Watson who was identified as the problem by most prominent atheists who chose to share an opinion on the subject. She was the divisive one. She was the one who wasn't being fair. She was the one that most people sought to discredit and marginalize, and the few well-known atheists who came to her defense, folks like Greta Christina and P.Z. Myers, well, they were tagged as troublemakers too. Not Richard Dawkins, though. He was the reasonable one. Now let's shift from sexual harassment and the angry misogyny that complaints about it always seem to unleash in the atheist community to racism, and look at a more recent example. A few months ago, Sam Harris, considered, like Dawkins, to be one of the four horsemen of so-called New Atheism, welcomed Charles Murray as a guest on his podcast. Murray was the author of The Bell Curve, which purported to show that race was a significant factor in determining intelligence. Murray's book has long since been widely discredited and renounced as a work of modern-day scientific racism. But Harris welcomed him to the show like a wrongfully deposed king returning from exile. He declared that Murray's conclusions were undeniable. And when the backlash came from people who objected to one of the most prominent figures in the atheist community amplifying and endorsing the views of a discredited old racist, the expected defenses from Harris's legions of supporters soon followed. Oh, you must not have listened to the entire podcast. He's just being taken out of context. He didn't say that. Okay, he did say that, but that's not what he meant. Okay, that is what he meant, but that's not racist. If Sam Harris fits your definition of racist, then the problem is with your definition, not with Sam Harris. Even more recently, Harris took to his podcast to declare his opposition in no uncertain terms to the Black Lives Matter movement, saying that Black Americans organizing around the variable of race was obviously destructive to civil society. As I record this, Harris has yet to release his lengthy, pedantic explanation of why his denouncing of Black Lives Matter, and indeed of the entire enterprise of Black civil rights activism, is not at all racist. But I'm sure it's coming. He'll take pains to explain in laborious detail why he isn't racist and why folks accusing people like him of being racist is the real problem. He did the same thing a couple years ago when he was called out for his sexism after he said that maybe the reason why atheism can't attract as many women to the movement is because it lacks that nurturing extra estrogen vibe that you need to really draw the women folk in. Maybe he'll mention how many black friends he has, or how many black commentators whose work he truly appreciates, just to prove that he's not racist. Again, he did the same thing in response to the sexism charge. I can't possibly be sexist. Look at all these women who I'm friends with. Come on, sexist? Me? He did the same thing when he was called out for his disgusting anti-Muslim bigotry. Oh, I'm not an anti-Muslim bigot. Look at all these Muslims and ex-Muslims I'm friends with. Well, what about Majid Nawaz? What about Sarah Hayder? What about Ayaan Hirsi Ali? That's ridiculous. I can't possibly be bigoted against Muslims. Come on, I'm Sam Harris. I have Muslim friends. That's what he's always done before. That's what he'll most likely do this time, and he'll probably sound a lot like David Smalley when he does it. Here's the point. It's not divisiveness that is killing the atheist movement. It's the reflexive defensiveness exemplified by Richard Dawkins and the other vicious reactions to Rebecca Watson's elevator story, and Sam Harris and his army of apologists. We atheists love to revel in our rationality. We're not like those religious people. We're reasonable. We can think critically. But you know what I've noticed? We're pretty good at thinking critically about everything except ourselves. We can zero in on racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, you name it. And we can lock on to every single argument used to defend those things and blow them all out of the water, as long as we are aiming at some other group. We hear about women being raped in Saudi Arabia. Outrageous, disgusting. How can this barbarity be allowed in the 21st century? Civilized people cannot tolerate such a thing. We hear about women being raped at secular conferences. Oh, stop causing trouble. Don't make a big deal about this. You're not going to tell anyone else, are you? And when one of our leaders, say a best-selling author or the host of a popular podcast or a frequent speaker at conferences, is criticized for saying or doing something harmful, what do? Do we apply that unbiased critical thinking we're so proud of? Do we hold them accountable? Do we put the good of the community first? Some of us do, or try to, but some of us, a lot of us, way too many of us, reflexively circle the wagons. When concerns are raised about someone, whether it's about something that they said or something that they did, the response from a lot of us is to pull out that person's resume. Oh no, he can't be racist. Look here, where he said he hates racism. And here, and look at those references. Look at all those black folks. A woman says he did what? Oh no, not this guy, he's a feminist. He says so all the time. She must be lying, probably just wants the attention. It's bad enough when someone whips out the resume on someone else's behalf. It's even worse when they try the same trick to defend themselves. How dare you accuse me, of saying something racist? Haven't you seen my record? Don't you know who I am? Who are you to say that something I did was a problem? You know, it's people like you, criticizing people like me, who are going to kill this movement. Remember, skepticism is something that's directed outward, never inward. If you don't think you're a racist, then you're not one. If you consciously abhor sexism, then you can't possibly ever say or do anything sexist. And if you're absolutely certain that you weren't behaving inappropriately with her, then you weren't. That's it. End of story. To hell with what she has to say about it. There's no such thing as unintended consequences. There's no such thing as unconscious bias. We're too divided, they say. There's too much partisanship in atheism now. That's the problem. Atheism should be a movement where everyone is welcome. And as long as we continue to give popular, influential members of the community the perpetual benefit of the doubt, as long as we grant them ally tenure and agree not to raise a fuss when one of them says something insensitive or ignorant or flat out bigoted, and as long as we all continue to look the other way when they're accused of misconduct, we can have that movement. Well, I don't want that movement. I don't want racists to be welcome in this movement. I don't want misogynists to be welcome in this movement. I don't want anti-Muslim bigots or religious bigots of any kind to be welcome in this movement. I don't want sexual harassers or rapists to be welcome in this movement. And I don't want their apologists to be welcome in this movement. And I don't want people like Rebecca Watson or Stephanie Zvan or Allison Smith to be unwelcome or vilified and shunned because they complained about the wrong thing or called out the wrong person. If you're more worried about people being called out for racism than you are about racism, if you're more concerned about people being accused of sexual misconduct than you are about people actually committing that misconduct, if you're more alarmed about people being called Nazis or Nazi sympathizers than you are about the number of actual Nazis and Nazi sympathizers in the atheist community, because don't think I forgot about that, then maybe the problem isn't the people raising these concerns. Maybe the problem is you. Maybe the thing about the atheist movement that needs to change is you. If you feel attacked by me saying that, if you suspect that you might be one of the people that I'm talking about here, prove me wrong. Turn that unfailing skepticism around and look at yourself and think about what you see. If the way you see yourself is significantly different from how other people see you, Think about why that might be, and leave enough room for the possibility that maybe the people who see you in that way aren't being hysterical or overly sensitive. Maybe it's you. Maybe you're not as enlightened or tolerant or innocent as you think you are. Maybe you are the one who needs to change. If you're not willing to at least entertain that possibility, then you're not much of a skeptic. Then again, that's never really been the point for some of you, has it? When you say atheists need to stop dividing the movement, what you mean is atheists need to stop giving me a hard time when I say or do something foolish or harmful. It's not really important to you to actually be an open-minded, reasonable, skeptical, self-aware person. It's more important to you that others regard your wisdom as unquestionable and your conduct as above reproach. And that being the case, I really do think it's you who is in the wrong movement, not your critics. With that attitude, you don't belong in atheism. Have you considered the priesthood?